4 words. That's all it takes in the original Greek of Luke 15 to mark the exact turning point of the most famous parable Jesus ever told. And almost every English Bible smooths those 4 words into something so ordinary sounding you'd never guess they're doing something almost clinical underneath. He came to himself. You've heard that line 100 times if you've heard the parable of the prodigal son even once. It sounds like a mild little narrator's aside. A polite way of saying, he thought it over, or, he changed his mind. But the actual Greek phrase behind it, heauton de elthon, isn't narrating a change of opinion. It's the language ancient Greek used for something much more specific, a person coming back to their right mind after being, in some real sense, not themselves. This video is about what that phrase actually meant to the people who first heard it, why Luke chose it instead of a dozen more ordinary options, and what it tells you about everything that happens both before and after that single verse. Start with where the phrase sits, because position matters here. Luke 15 verse 17 comes right in the middle of the story, at its lowest point, not at the moment the son leaves home, not at the moment he's forgiven, but at the moment he's alone in a foreign country, having spent everything, hired out to feed someone else's pigs, so hungry he's eyeing the pods the pigs are eating. That is where the text places this phrase. Not at a moral high point. Not during a moment of clear thinking. Right in the middle of the wreckage, with nothing left and nobody offering him anything. To understand why that placement matters, you have to go back a few verses and look at the specific word Luke uses to describe how the son had been living before this moment. Verse 13, he squandered his property in reckless living. That phrase, reckless living, translates one Greek word. Asotos, an adverb built from a root meaning something like unsalvageable or beyond recovery, the same family of words used elsewhere in Greek for a life so given over to excess that it can't be pulled back from the edge. It's a strong word. Not, he had some fun. Not, he made a few bad choices. Asotos describes a total, structureless collapse, money and time and self-control all draining out in the same direction at once, with nothing held back and no plan to stop. Hold that word in mind, because it's the condition the coming to himself phrase is answering. If the son's life before this moment is described as asotos, unsalvageable, beyond his own ability to recover, then whatever coming to himself means, it has to be strong enough to answer that. A mild little, he had second thoughts, doesn't match the weight of the word that came 4 verses earlier. Something bigger has to be happening in verse 17, and the Greek phrase itself tells you what it is. heauton de elthon. Break it into its pieces, because each one is doing real work. Eis is a preposition meaning, into, or, toward, motion in a direction. Heauton is the reflexive pronoun, himself. Elthon is a form of the verb erchomai, to come, or, to go, the same ordinary verb used constantly throughout the Gospels for people walking from one place to another. Put together, plainly, it reads, having come into himself, or having come to himself. On the surface, that's just a phrase about arriving somewhere. Except that somewhere here isn't a place on a map. It's a person's own mind. This is where you need to know something about how Greek writers outside the Bible use this exact kind of language, because Luke isn't inventing a strange new idiom out of nothing. He's reaching for an expression his readers would already have recognized from wider Greek usage. Ancient commentators and later close readers of this text, the kind of careful line-by-line Greek scholars who spend their whole careers noticing exactly this sort of thing, have long pointed out that phrases built this way, describing someone coming to or returning to themselves, were used in the broader Greek world for exactly one recurring situation. A person recovering from a state where they were, in some meaningful sense, not themselves. Recovering from madness. Recovering from a drunken stupor. Recovering from any condition where a person's normal, rational self had been, for a while, somewhere else, absent, overridden, replaced by something less than who they actually were. That's the tradition this phrase is drawing on. And it reframes the entire preceding scene. The son isn't simply broke and hungry when verse 17 opens. According to the logic embedded in this specific phrase, he has been, up to this point, somehow absent from his own right mind, not insane in a clinical sense, but functionally not himself, the way that word gets used for someone acting under the influence of something that has temporarily displaced their normal judgment. Reckless living, Asotos, wasn't just bad decision-making. It was, in the vocabulary this phrase belongs to, a kind of derangement. A period where the son's actual self, his real judgment, his real values, had gone missing, and someone or something else had been steering instead. Sit with that for a second, because it changes what the moment in verse 17 is actually claiming to be. If coming to himself simply meant he reconsidered his plan, you'd expect a completely different kind of trigger. Maybe a conversation, maybe a piece of good advice, maybe a moment of quiet reflection somewhere peaceful. That is not what triggers this. What triggers it is hunger. Physical, desperate, watching pigs eat better than you hunger. The text is blunt about this, no one was giving him anything. He is at the absolute floor. And it's exactly there, at the floor, that the phrase heauton de elthon shows up, not because suffering is noble, and not because the text is romanticizing rock bottom, but because that particular kind of unbearable, undeniable physical reality is often precisely what breaks through whatever fog a person has been operating inside of. You can talk yourself out of an uncomfortable thought. It's much harder to talk yourself out of genuine hunger. Now look at what happens the instant this phrase takes effect, because the very next words out of the son's own mouth are the clearest possible evidence for what, coming to himself, actually restored. Verse 17 continues, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger." Notice what kind of thinking that sentence represents. It's comparative. It's specific. It's accurate. He isn't spiraling into self-pity or fantasy, he's doing basic, sober arithmetic. My father's lowest employees eat better than I do right now, and that gap is not something I have to keep accepting. That is not the thinking of someone still lost in a fog of Asotos, reckless excess. That is the thinking of a person whose ordinary, rational faculties have just switched back on. And it keeps going, verse by verse, in exactly that same clear-eyed register. Verse 18, "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you." Look at the precision here. He doesn't say, "I made some mistakes," or, "things didn't work out." He names the exact category of what happened, sin, against heaven, and before his father specifically, with none of the vague, self-protective softening that shame usually reaches for. This is a person doing honest accounting, not a person still trying to manage how bad things look. Verse 19 keeps that same sober tone, "I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." He has already run the numbers on his own standing and accepted the answer, without negotiating himself back up to a better outcome than the facts actually support. All three of those things, the comparison to the hired servants, the specific confession, the honest self-assessment about no longer being worthy, happen after he came to himself, and every single one of them reads as the output of a mind that has just come back online after being somewhere else. That's the internal evidence for what this phrase is doing. It isn't decorating the moment he decides to go home. It's explaining why he's suddenly capable of the kind of clear thinking that decision actually requires. Even the verb Luke picks for what happens next carries a little more weight than it looks like on the surface. Verse 18, I will arise and go to my father. Anastas, having arisen, from the same root, Existemi, that the New Testament will later use again and again for resurrection itself, Anastasis. No responsible reading of this parable should turn that into a hidden prophecy of the empty tomb. Luke is using a common, everyday verb for standing up, the same word used constantly throughout the Gospels for someone simply getting up off the ground. But it's worth noticing anyway, the way you'd notice a deliberate echo in a piece of music. The vocabulary of a dead thing being raised back to a functioning life was already sitting there, available in ordinary Greek, ready to be picked up again later for something much larger. A son who was, in every sense this phrase implies, gone from himself, gets up. The word for, gets up, is the same word a Greek-speaking Christian a generation later would use to talk about a body getting up from a grave. This is a good place to pause the walk-through for a moment, because if this kind of close reading, one word, one phrase, traced all the way through its actual weight in the original language, is useful to you, this channel does exactly this almost every week. Taking one word or phrase most people read straight past, and slowing down long enough to see what it's actually carrying. If that's something you want more of, consider subscribing. And with that said, back into the text, because the phrase still has more to say. There's a second piece of vocabulary worth bringing in here, because the New Testament actually gives you the mirror image of this phrase elsewhere, and seeing the two side by side makes the contrast almost impossible to miss. The Greek word existemi, literally out of, plus histemi, to stand, means to stand outside yourself, and it's the word behind, out of his mind, in Mark 3 verse 21, where Jesus' own family, hearing what he's been doing, go to restrain him because people are saying he is out of his mind. It's the same root behind the crowd's astonishment in places like Acts, and behind Paul's own line in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 13, if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. Existemi describes standing outside your own proper place, displaced from your own center. Now put the two words next to each other, existemi, to stand outside yourself, and the phrase in Luke 15, berkamai eis heauton, to come into yourself. They're not the same word, and Luke isn't setting up a formal wordplay between them. But they belong to the same conceptual family, describing opposite directions of the same basic motion, one away from your true self, one back toward it. The prodigal son's whole arc, read this way, is a trip out and a trip back, and the phrase in verse 17 is the exact midpoint where the direction reverses. There's a companion detail worth pulling in here, because Luke's Gospel gives you an explicit contrast just one parable earlier that makes the madness reading even sharper. Back in Luke 12, in the parable of the rich fool, Jesus describes a wealthy man planning bigger barns for his abundant harvest, entirely confident in his own future, right up until God says to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you." That man never comes to himself. He dies still fully inside his own plan, still convinced his reasoning was sound, with no moment in the text where anything breaks through. Put the two parables side by side and the difference is stark. One man goes to his grave never once stepping outside his own distorted certainty, the other man, at the absolute bottom of his own worst decisions, has a moment where the fog lifts and he sees his situation exactly as it actually is. Luke doesn't say this pairing out loud, but the vocabulary and structure line the two stories up for you to notice it yourself. It's worth pausing here. Because if you take this reading seriously, it changes something important about how you think about the nature of sin itself, at least according to the picture this parable is drawing. The rebellion that sent the younger son out the door in the first place. Demanding his inheritance early, effectively telling his father, "You're dead to me as far as I'm concerned, give me my share now." That rebellion isn't presented primarily as a rule broken on a checklist somewhere. It's presented as a kind of self-alienation. Something in him left, not just geographically, but psychologically. He became, in the vocabulary this phrase evokes, someone other than his actual self, someone whose judgment had been overridden by appetite and impulse. Wrongdoing, on this reading, isn't only a debt racked up against a rule. It's a kind of exile from your own right mind, and it's possible to be so deep in that exile that you don't even experience it as anything unusual. Asotos becomes just how you live, the new normal, right up until circumstances get severe enough to shake you loose from it. Go back to the phrase one more time and notice something structural about it. It's built around motion. Heauton, into himself. Elthon, having come. The whole expression is directional, describing a journey, and it's worth noticing that this small, internal journey, coming into himself, happens before the larger, external journey actually starts. Verse 20 says, "He arose and came to his father." That's the physical trip home. But grammatically and narratively, it's the second journey in this passage, not the first. The first journey is entirely internal, entirely private, witnessed by no one but the son himself, standing in a foreign field surrounded by someone else's pigs. Nobody sends him a message. Nobody comes looking for him yet. The turn happens alone, inside him, before a single physical step is taken toward home. That detail matters more than it might seem to at first. It means the reconciliation that follows, the father running down the road, the robe, the ring, the sandals, the fattened calf, the whole celebration. All of that external restoration is responding to an internal return that had already happened first, quietly, with no audience. The son doesn't earn his way back into clear thinking by first fixing his circumstances. He doesn't get his mind back after solving his hunger problem. The order runs the other way, the mind comes back first, while the hunger and the mess end. The distance from home are all still fully in place, and only then does he act on what that restored clarity tells him to do. Coming to yourself, in other words, isn't the reward for getting your life back together. In this story, it's the very first thing that happens, before any of the actual repair work has even started. That has a shape to it worth sitting with honestly, because it cuts against how a lot of people instinctively think about turning their life around. The common assumption runs, get your circumstances under control first, and clarity will follow, clean up the mess, and then you'll feel like yourself again. This parable describes the exact opposite sequence. The son is still hungry. He is still a hired hand for a stranger. He has not yet spoken to his father, has not yet been forgiven, has not yet had a single circumstance actually change. And it's precisely there, with nothing fixed yet, that his right mind returns to him. Clarity, in this story, isn't the finish line. It's the starting gun. There's also something worth noticing in what the son doesn't do once he comes to himself, because it would have been an available option and the text pointedly has him reject it. He does not decide to stay away and simply manage his situation better where he is. Get a second job, ration his food more carefully, tough it out until the famine passes. Coming to his right mind doesn't just make him a more competent version of a person still living apart from his father. It makes him want to go back. The restored clarity and the return home aren't two separate decisions loosely connected. They're the same decision, arrived at in the same moment, because once he can actually see his situation clearly, staying estranged stops looking like an option worth choosing. That's worth noticing, because it means the phrase isn't just describing sound judgment in the abstract. It's describing sound judgment specifically about a relationship, about where he actually belongs, and what it will cost him to keep pretending otherwise. Think about how often this same basic pattern shows up outside of any explicitly religious framing at all, in perfectly ordinary situations. Somebody deep in a destructive relationship, a compulsive habit, a spending pattern, a way of talking to the people who love them. Functioning the entire time, going to work, paying at least some bills, appearing basically fine from the outside. And then some specific, often unglamorous moment arrives, a diagnosis, a lost job, a friend finally saying the hard thing, or nothing dramatic at all, just an ordinary Tuesday that happens to be the one where the fog finally lifts, and they describe it afterward in almost exactly this language, even without knowing a word of Greek. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't myself. It's like I woke up. That instinct to describe a moral or practical turnaround as a kind of waking up, a return to one's actual self rather than just a change of plan, is old enough and common enough across languages and cultures that Luke could reach for it in first-century Greek and expect his audience to recognize it instantly, the same way you'd recognize it today. It's also worth being precise about what this phrase is not claiming, because it would be easy to overread it. Coming to himself is not the parable's word for salvation, and it's not doing the theological work that later New Testament writers do with words like repentance or faith. It's psychologically and narratively prior to those things. It's what makes the actual turn possible in the first place, not a substitute for it. The son still has to get up. He still has to walk the road. He still has to say the words he's rehearsed, out loud, to his father's face, and mean them. Coming to himself doesn't do any of that work for him. What it does is restore the clear-eyed judgment that makes doing it possible at all. Pulling him out of the fog just far enough to see, accurately, exactly where he is and exactly what he needs to do about it. There's one more piece of this parable worth bringing in before wrapping up, because Luke doesn't end the story with the younger son at all. And the way he ends it puts the whole, coming to himself, phrase in even sharper relief. The parable's final scene belongs to the older brother, standing outside his own father's celebration, refusing to go in, listing out loud every year of dutiful, resentful service he's rendered while his father, he says, never even gave him a young goat to celebrate with his friends. And here's the detail worth noticing, the older brother never gets a version of verse 17. There's no moment in the text where Luke writes anything like, and the older son came to himself. The parable simply ends, literally ends, mid-scene. With the father still out in the yard, still pleading with him, no confirmation either way of whether the invitation lands. Whatever has kept the older brother locked outside his own family's joy, resentment, a scorekeeping kind of righteousness, a belief that his own obedience should have purchased him something more than a relationship. Luke leaves it completely unresolved, on purpose. The word study built around one small phrase in verse 17 turns out to double as a diagnostic for both brothers. One of them gets a documented, narrated moment of clear-eyed return, precisely because he'd gone somewhere far enough away to notice he'd left. The other brother, who never physically left the property at all, never in the story shows any comparable sign of coming to himself. Which raises the quieter, harder question the parable leaves sitting in the room. Which kind of distance from your true self is actually easier to recognize, the kind that gets you exiled in a foreign country eating from a pig trough, or the kind that lets you stand right next to everything good and still miss what it means? That question is worth sitting with honestly, because most people reading this parable identify instinctively with whichever brother they don't currently resemble. It's easy to hear the younger son's story as a warning about obvious, visible collapse, the kind of Asotos living anyone would recognize from a distance. And quietly assume that anyone who hasn't hit that kind of rock bottom doesn't need a coming to himself moment of their own. But the parable's own ending argues against that reading. The older brother's exile is quieter, more respectable, entirely compatible with a life that looks, from the outside, faultless. And it's precisely because it looks faultless that it's so much harder for him, or for anyone in his position, to recognize that a return trip is needed at all. Coming to yourself doesn't require having wasted an inheritance in a foreign country. It only requires noticing, honestly, when your own version of the story has quietly drifted somewhere Luke would recognize as beside yourself. Which brings you back to where this video started, with 4 small Greek words carrying more weight than almost any English translation lets on. He came to himself is not a throwaway narrator's transition sentence. It's the hinge the entire parable turns on. The moment a young man who had, in every meaningful sense, gone missing from his own right mind, finally comes back into himself, in the middle of a foreign field, with nothing fixed yet and no one watching, and from there decides, clearly, honestly, accurately, to go home. The next time you read this parable, or the next time you catch yourself using almost this exact language about your own life. I don't know what I was thinking, I wasn't myself. It's worth remembering that the Bible got there first, in one carefully chosen Greek phrase, describing the oldest and most universal turning point there is, the moment a person finally comes back to who they actually are.